Hello and welcome to Insight. I'm Kusum Wijetilleke. Today we'll be speaking to Rehana Thowfeek, an economist attached to the Advocata Institute. She's a graduate of the University of London and the University of Warwick. Thank you for being with us, Rehana. I've been reading your work for a while. I follow you on Twitter, and written by Ray, your blog has been very interesting. I've been using it to get myself up to date on economics. I'd urge everyone out there to go and check it out. As we were just talking off camera, how interesting it is at the moment to be an economist in Sri Lanka. There's a lot of divergent opinions, and I don't think anybody expected at the beginning of the pandemic that things would perhaps get this bad, even though there were a lot of people that were saying that things are going to get bad.
Thanks, Kusum, for having me and inviting me here, and for checking out my blog as well. Yeah, I think on the economy, there has been, alarm bells have been sort of sounded by a lot of, senior economists for quite a while now, especially on the issue of debt sustainability. And then once sort of COVID came, and then we went into the whole pandemic situation, and we lost a lot of tourism revenue. So because of that, it sort of precipitated the decline a lot further than probably we had thought before the pandemic.
Okay.
So now what we are seeing is really a manifestation of a lot of the structural issues that have been going on in the economy. Like if you take the issue of budget deficit, and if you take the issue of state sector employment, all of these have all sort of now come to, we are pretty much at what you would call like a critical juncture.
Right.
So now we have ended up in this kind of situation, and we are finding sort of the response by the government to be not as ideal as probably we would have hoped. And then there's also, because of the recovery from the pandemic, there's also a lot of global issues there are supply chain issues and inflation. So all of that is also making the situation a lot worse for everyday citizens.
Right. So, just to set the stage, in 2020, Sri Lanka had the highest budget deficit since 1982. Expenditure in 2020 was reallocated to 2019, which was the first time that's happened, I believe. I believe the MP, Dr. Harsha De Silva, brought this up. It contradicted the previous annual reports. Dr. Nishan Dimel has mentioned that this was clearly done to reduce the budget deficit for 2020, which was officially around 11%, but he says the real figure is around 14 to 15%. Ministry of Finance revenue projections, 2019, the revenue projections were missed by 20%. In 2020, it's missed by 23%. So even the basic of projecting what kind of revenue you're going to get, what little revenue we're going to get, 72% of revenue was used to make interest payments in 2020. And that is the highest proportion of revenue as interest payments compared to all other nations with similar levels of debt. Now, we can talk about debt payments in a little while, but I just want to focus on revenue, because one of the things that this government did immediately after they came in was a big bonanza essentially to the private sector, and also to individuals. We have to say certain consumption taxes, VAT, those that we consider regressive were reduced, taken away. Mm-hmm. Corporate taxes were at the lowest in Southeast Asia after Gotabaya Rajapaksa's tax cuts. I think there's been some shift in the budget, so I'd like you to touch on that as well. But can we just talk about why do you think the government went the route of depriving the treasury of so much revenue? Why did you, I suppose the basic is that, if you cut taxes on businesses will do better. But do you see that has played out?
Yeah, so it's interesting that you mentioned the 2020 budget deficit of 1.6 trillion rupees.
Right, yeah.
Actually, we should also, if you look at the 2022 budget deficit forecast, it's also 1.6 trillion dollars. So that rupees. So that's also a lot of money. It's earlier we thought that's a record, but now the record is becoming the norm. And in 2021, it was 1.8 trillion. So, that's okay because we were in a pandemic situation and there were certain issues. And especially now when we are going into this very crucial year with all our debt repayments and everyone's eyes on us, and we are still sort of going down this same route. And I think, so if you look before 2019, just before we sort of lost the IMF, the extended facility, they decided to sort of pull it prematurely because we had, gone for tax breaks and gone that route. I mean, I honestly don't know what the sort of the objective is. Most likely it was to sort of consolidate their electoral gains, because there was a 2019 victory for President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, and then in 2020 we saw another parliamentary victory for his party. So it was most likely to consolidate that gain. That's what we have sort of.
I think by and large the consensus seems to be that by reducing government revenue, obviously rating agencies will look at our revenue projections and think, okay, these guys can't afford to pay our debt. That deprives us of access to global capital markets. Now, why is something that seems pretty straightforward? I'm not a professional economist like you, but it seems everybody in the media seems to understand this very basic dynamic. So it seems almost straightforward. Could you tell us what happened in the 2022 budget in terms of some of the taxes? I know that they increased some taxes, but not all. Could you touch on that briefly?
Sure. So I think the biggest, I mean, we just look at the total number, total value of the tax revenue that was collected. Okay. And we should keep in mind that tax revenue is a significantly huge proportion of government revenue. Right. There's a very small margin, sort of very small component of non-tax revenue. So that is essentially where the government gets all its money. Right. So if the government was to go for a sort of reducing taxes and trying to give tax breaks to encourage private businesses to set up and, you know, maybe increase employment, then you also have to think about how are you really going to go for such a big budget deficit, and how are you going to cut down on expenses. But unfortunately, we did not see a shift in sort of, or a change in the expenses that the government was sort of, you know, wanting to spend. Okay. So then we ended up with this huge budget deficit, and it's a bad situation to be in. Right. You mentioned on your blog specifically the motor vehicle accident tax, which is a very strange tax to have brought about. Yes. I'm not sure what the thinking was behind that. But then the obvious ones they've done is the social security contribution tax, which you mentioned, VAT on financial services, which I think makes sense, cigarettes excise. What is the do we have a lot of indirect taxes, do you think, relative to, from the data that you've seen, relative to other economies of our size and scope? Do you think our consumption taxes are too high? Do you think at the moment we don't have a choice, we may have to increase them anyway? What do you think? I have not looked at sort of compared Sri Lanka to other countries, right. But if we look at our own sort of how tax, the composition has evolved, we do collect a lot of the revenue from taxes on goods and services and border taxes. Indirect taxes, which are, you know, which it's proven that it's, you know, it is regressive, because it sort of disproportionately burdens a lot of poor people who, you know, go out and buy, you know, just their goods, everyday stuff from the supermarket. So I think sort of,
if you were to look at, I mean, for example, corporate taxes were 28% to 35% before the Gotabaya administration. They've brought this down to between 14 and 18. I don't know what happened in the most recent budget, but what do you feel about corporate taxes? It seems like a relatively easy thing to do, considering the profits that many of the major companies have made. The financial sector especially has been doing extremely well. Their interest income margins are higher than they were a year ago, even though rates across the country reduced. And most of the big conglomerates have made very healthy margins. So don't you think it's like an open goal that the government just is afraid to take?
So I think with the cut down on corporate taxes, a lot of the companies enjoyed sort of a tax windfall.
Yes.
Because the rate was, you know, cut almost sliced in half, yes. They suddenly saw their profit after tax was a lot higher. Right. So, I mean, definitely I think that if, you know, our tax system is regressive and we are burdening a lot of poor people. And actually, if you look at it, if you look at the cost of food in Sri Lanka, which is comparatively very expensive when you compare to other countries. And the famous sort of anecdote is that chicken is cheaper in Singapore than in Sri Lanka. So the reason that is because of all the taxes that we put on food items. Right. And actually, there are studies that have proven that taxing corporates at the end of sort of at the, you know, if you take their sort of from production to the end where they make the profit, it's actually better to tax them at the end than to tax them at the start, which is what we do. We tax sort of the raw materials that come down, and then we tax the consumers, and what ends up happening is they pass on these taxes to consumers, which increases the prices that consumers have to pay. So we need to really focus on, what sort of tax regime and what sort of country do we want to be? Do we want to be a country which sort of burdens the poor with all these taxes, or do we want to be a country that, because the purpose of taxes really is to redistribute wealth, right?
Exactly.
And are we really doing that?
Okay, so interesting that you asked the question, what kind of country do we want to be? So I think this is interesting because recently I think it's the National People's Power, that's Anukumar Desanayaka's coalition, the JVP-led coalition, they released their manifesto. The manifesto was a bit of a mix and match. I've written about it. Quite a few commentators have written about it. One of the things that the JVP and generally the leftist parties tend to do is sort of critique the global economy and the open economy. The NPP manifesto itself was quite confused, so I won't go into that too much. But where do you stand on this critique of free trade, neoliberalism, considering the Trump phenomena and how he sort of changed the conversation about free trade in a way, for a better or for worse, considering Sri Lanka's dependency on exports and foreign markets? Is there any sense in Sri Lanka making this critique of neoliberalism and free trade?
Honestly, I don't think it's sensible, because even though we always tell, or we always say that we are a trade-oriented country, we are actually very protectionist.
Yes.
There are lots of import barriers and import taxes that pretty much keeps sort of the outside world at bay, and it allows a lot of domestic sort of companies, or like what we call in economics rent-seeking behavior, where they make undue profits because of these protectionist structures. Right. And a lot of people have written about it, people who know far more about this than I, and the need to get rid of these sort of make Sri Lanka more open. I mean, it's not even a question, and I definitely don't agree that we should be critiquing.
I mean, I suppose to play the devil's advocate, I think they'll say that the conversations are that if you end up allowing imports in, that you essentially, it's competition, you're introducing competition. And what's proven to be the case in Sri Lanka is that our labor laws and our labor culture, let's say, broadly, isn't competitive, right? So then it comes back to your question about what kind of country do we want to be. I mean, it's not easy to fire an employee in Sri Lanka. Good or bad, I don't know. It depends on your point of view. There's a social safety net, whether that's enough, whether it's not adequate, whether it's sustainable, aside it exists. In your view, on a personal view and as an economist, how do you view this trade-off? Because economics is about trade-offs, right? So how do you protect worker rights, worker protections? How do you enforce that kind of thing versus competing with this global supply chain and the global market? How do we balance those two?
Yeah, so on the labor law issue, there is sort of this understanding that our labor laws are quite restrictive, and that keeps a lot of sort of investors out, because they don't have the flexibility to hire and fire. But I think there's a bigger issue. There's a larger issue than just the matter of our labor law. They are staying away for much bigger issues than just the labor, right?
Right, okay.
So we need to address sort of that entire gamut of issues rather than focusing on this one issue.
True.
And definitely, I mean, we don't need to box ourselves into, we are going to be an open economy, we are going to forget about workers' rights. There's always, like as you said, there's a trade-off, and there's always give and take, right? You give a little and you take a little. And there is definitely lots of room to protect worker rights. And the other thing I would like to say is, even though we think we have really strong labor laws, you do come across so many anecdotal cases where laborers are treated terribly and in really bad fashion. So I mean,
that's a good point, because I think a lot of people assume that having strict labor laws is a protection against exploitation, but I think we've seen it with our own eyes. Exploitation is
It's actually not
rampant.
like
So
one of
that's a
the
fair
main
point.
examples is these manpower companies, right?
Exactly.
So
yes.
they'll always find loopholes, they'll always find workarounds, but really it comes down to, you know, how do we balance everything? And definitely, like if you're talking about investments, it's not just one point that needs to be addressed. There's like a whole array of issues that we need to focus on.
Dr. Nishan Dimel of Verity Research, I think he's, for me personally, come across as one of the more articulate commentators on the economy more recently. I saw the, I think it was the Economic Summit 2021 recently where he spoke. And right at the end, he said something very interesting. He said he thinks the private sector needs to come together because he says that the private sector may have to take some of the hit. Now, I just want to ask, I mean, it seems that the private sector already came together when they got these tax cuts. And I just wonder how that's sort of come about. I mean, if in terms of Dr. Nishan Dimel's, what he's saying about our roadmap. So he's saying the idea is to build reserves up to 4 months of imports, so 6 to 7 billion US dollars. He says sovereign credit rating upgrade is essential and keeping interest rates at single digits will be helpful. Primary deficit under 3%. And he calls for, well, he's not called for it, but he said this is an option, preemptively restructuring debt. And he used a few examples. Ecuador was the best one where I think they restructured preemptively before they defaulted. I don't know if it was going to manage this a default or if they just restructured, but they went from CCC to, I think, B- in 6 months. Do you see something like that as a possibility for our country?
I mean, it definitely depends on what the government and the central bank decides to pursue, because what we can see is the policies and the sort of rhetoric that they have followed, we have consistently been downgraded in the markets. And, you know, it really doesn't matter what statement the central bank sends out, because the investors are going to be looking at, you know, what S&P is saying or what Moody's is saying. So, I mean,
Right.
rather than sort of trying to, always being on the, we are always on the defensive, right? We're always trying to defend something that we do. So, I think what Dr. Nishan Dimel is sort of advocating is taking more of an offensive approach, where I think I've also watched some of his interviews and all these sort of things he has sort of said. And what he's saying is that we need to go to them with a plan. Be proactive, right? And, you know, unless, and everybody, I think there's this sort of misconception that when people call for a default, because there was recently entire collective of Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, lots of business leaders asking the government to sort of defer the 500 million US dollar bond payment and to instead focus on bringing down, you know, the imports that people need. I think the issue there is it's you know, we are thinking, okay, this 500 million, and then there's also more debate about whether we should defer, because it can lead to a whole host of these other issues. But we are not just looking at 500 million payout, right? This course of this year, we have to pay $7.3 billion. I mean, where are we going to get this money? It's not just a matter of the 500 million, it's a matter of how and when are we going to, you know.
Yeah, I also think it's something that isn't discussed enough. Mr. Cabral Ajit Nivad Cabral is the governor of the central bank, and you said investors take their cues from the rating agencies. Somewhere, someone seems to think that the central bank governor making very bullish statements and seeming very optimistic and having an overall air of confidence about the economy, that this is helpful, that this will improve our image with international investors. But can you just touch on that, because it sort of points to the issue that we have is that we won't be taken seriously if we go down this path, especially with a clearly politicized central bank, because perhaps people don't appreciate how important it is to have an independent institutions like the central bank, like the monetary board, like the finance ministry, that these have to be depoliticized. Can you just briefly comment on that, how we might be seen by investors?
Yes. I think Mr. Cabral's optimism is definitely something we should all admire, because to be in that position and to continue to sort of be optimistic. I mean, you have to be optimistic when you're the central bank governor who's in a, who's in a country like Sri Lanka, where Sri Lanka is at the moment. You have to be optimistic. I mean, if I was there, I would be extremely pessimistic. So, but I think along with the optimism, I think we need also to be more realistic about what our goals are and what sort of our plan is. So one good example is in Mr. Basil Rajapaksa's budget speech. He says that by 2022 we are going to increase double exports, right, to 22 billion USD. Now, I personally don't think that's a realistic goal, especially because we are also having all of these import issues, and a lot of the products that we bring down actually just feeds into the system, I mean the exports, right?
Right.
So I think optimism is good, but it has to be coupled with being realistic.
Right. There's a lot of conversation now because of all the debt. The debt is, all the financial news is about Sri Lanka's debt. Now, there's a lot of, I wouldn't say debate, but let's say there's interesting discussions around, for example, infrastructure development. Some people see it as necessary. Some people say it's a bit of a waste. Then you see mega projects like the port city. I know there's not a debt component, but there are other costs that you have to factor in. Then there's another aspect of it where I think we mentioned budget deficits. Now, what Dr. Howard Nicholas recently, he's another economist, I think he's Sri Lankan Dutch, he was talking about how budget deficits are bad, but he thinks the main problem might be a lack of industrialization. And he points to the 1990s in Sri Lanka, and specifically the Ranasinghe Premadasa government and I think it was a 300 garment factory project or the 200 garment factory project. He also looked at Sri Lanka's industrialization rate. I can't remember what the exact statistic was, but I saw the graph from the 90s to today. The industrialization has actually fallen. So I think the argument they're making is that, well, not that he made, but the argument might be that instead of industrialization, we've gone to financialization. So is this again an argument about the open economy and how we've allowed ourselves to just import without really looking at whether we can manufacture locally? But again, this brings the question of cost, right? Because we can probably manufacture most things that you can manufacture in other places. But what is the cost? Is it competitive? And if it's not competitive, what are we? Then we're back to square one. So would you mind just touching on whether you think, do you think the budget deficit is the problem or is it the symptom? Because Dr. Howard Nicholas seems to think that it's very much a symptom and it's not the actual main problem.
Right. So on, I think industrialization, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it probably, you would place a lot more emphasis on the private sector to drive industrialization than the government. Although I think in Sri Lanka, the government does play sort of a very big role in the commercial activities in the country, from deciding sort of what gets produced and, deciding prices. So there is, I think, probably we can, put that on the government as well, sort of say that, because you do play such a big sort of role in this commercial activity, that maybe they also should be driving industrialization. Now, I personally, I don't know to comment about the relationship between the budget deficit and industrialization. But I think sort of the budget deficit, especially when it comes to taxes, there is a component that also the private sector is involved in. So
I'd like to also touch on a piece you had written, I think it might have been for the Daily FT. So you made a very interesting point, Rehana. I wanted to just touch on it. You've said basically that because the debate right now is, in terms of solutions, is you have one side that is very anti-IMF. The government is basically saying, we're not going to go to the IMF no matter what. There's a political angle to this as well. Then you have Dr. Harsha De Silva, Mr. Ranveer Krimaratne, the MPs who are very much pro-IMF. I wonder where you fall on the IMF, and I just want to quote something you wrote. I'm just going to paraphrase here, and you said, we will be unable to avoid austerity because the point is that the country is undergoing a self-imposed IMF program in the form of import restrictions and a foreign currency shortage leading to what is essentially rationing. So I suppose from that I'll surmise that you are supportive of an IMF program.
Yes, I mean, I definitely think an IMF program is sort of the way to go. I know that we have sort of delayed the talks about debt, restructuring debt, and now we have. I saw recent articles. We are going to China and Japan and asking them to sort of restructure our debt. I mean, I can't think of sort of any other nation that has come to the brink that we are in and sort of come out of it without IMF support. And I think there's a misunderstanding that IMF is sort of going to bail us out. They're going to give us all the money and we can pay our debts just, like that. But actually what they're going to do is they're going to give us the credibility, which is something we don't have, the credibility and the confidence to go out and talk to our lenders and tell them, look, we are in a really bad situation and we need your help. So can you work with us? Now, if we do that just on our own, they're not going to take us seriously. So we need someone almost like a chaperone or a disciplinarian behind us to show that, okay, we are serious about the changes that we want to make.
Okay. The thing, I mean, my brief research into the IMF, the one that comes up is Joseph Stiglitz, who was, I think, the lead economist in the World Bank during the early 2000s, and he's, I think, written widely on the IMF. He I think points to, say, Pakistan and Haiti, for instance, which have had multi-decades, I think 30 years for Pakistan and 40 years for Haiti in terms of their IMF programs, and they're still very much in debt, still very much poverty-stricken countries. He points basically to conditional lending. Now, I think the point everyone makes in Sri Lanka, Dr. Harshadi Silva makes it best, that conditions are probably a good thing for Sri Lanka in some sense because we clearly have very little financial discipline. But is there some basis for this, for the idea that if we go in for an IMF program, that their restrictions will hamper our aggregate growth? Because we seem like there is certainly there's pent-up demand anyway among consumers, but there's also a pent-up demand amongst businesses to go into some kind of fast growth environment. Now, would those two things match? I mean, imagine we go into an IMF program, and let's say even a new government comes in and goes into an IMF program. Then that government gets hamstrung by the IMF conditions, and they can't spend, they can't create employment opportunities, etc. So come back to square one then. So how do you see the IMF in that sense?
So I mean, personally, I don't think we should be blaming IMF for the state we are in.
Of course,
and even if the other countries you mentioned, which were Pakistan and Haiti, I mean, what the IMF will do to us is they'll give us the support, but it's like that. There's a saying: if you can take the horse to the water, but you can't make the horse drink the water, right?
Right.
So we have to take the initiative and drink the water. We need to do the reforms which are necessary, and all the reforms that I think, I mean, of course, we don't know what an IMF program will look like if we do go into one. But based on sort of the past, but we can assume that we're going to be asked to sort of trim down our budget deficit, and we're going to be asked to sort of increase our tax revenue. So these are all things that we actually have to do. Whether it's the IMF telling us or whether it's, there are so many domestic experts telling us the same thing. So it's really a matter of, are we committed to it? Are we going to commit ourselves to reform? Because I've read one study by Professor Premathiratne.
Yes.
So he studied sort of the growth rates between when we were in IMF programs and when we were not, and actually he found a positive relationship between the years. So when we were in IMF programs, there was higher economic growth.
Okay, interesting.
So I think it's something that we need to commit to, and I'm not sure why we're always on the defensive with IMF. It should be about sort of how do we work with them to get ourselves out of this situation and to permanently make sure that we don't go back to it again.
Sri Lanka has a history of price controls and subsidies. Now, it seems obviously silly that we control the prices of goods for everyone and at a huge cost to the government and the treasury. But of course, the alternative which has happened now, where the removal of price controls, people are left high and dry because incomes haven't gone up, there's no way they're going to be able to afford the actual price of a good. How come there's not been any kind of transition plan? And I understand that there may be a lack of data when it comes to trying to target people with certain state subsidies, food stamps, vouchers, whatever it may be. That seems like it might be one of the main challenges going forward, where you really have to equip the IRS the Internal Revenue Service, to really go and study who needs, instead of giving a blanket price control.
So the issue with price controls is basically it has repressed the inflation rates, right?
Yes.
So the natural growth of the prices over time. So obviously that feeds into again to wage growth, because if you are not seeing a very, some certain level of price, then you're not going to increase your wages, right? So that's why now with the the removal of price controls, now you see suddenly, everybody's purchasing power falling so rapidly. Anyway, you can't, in an economy, nobody can sort of adjust to something like that overnight, right? So that's why because we had followed these policies for quite a long time, and now we've decided to completely let go of them. We are seeing ourselves in a situation where sort of the prices of essentials are really skyrocketing. And obviously wages will struggle to keep up with it, because because of the repression that has taken place over time, the wages have not sort of adjusted to the growth, that it ought to have.
And you made this point on your blog as well regarding the salary bills. In 2021, the government of Sri Lanka's salary bill, 634 billion rupees, 204 billion rupees on defense ministry salaries, and another 113 billion on public security ministry salaries. So that's a total of 350,000 people. So that's a case where you've pointed out it's a lot of people, lower salaries. And then you point out that there's an exception at the Samurdhi. Do you want to just tell us about what's happening in the Samurdhi?
Sure, yes. So I think Samurdhi, which is, called the flagship social sort of assistance program in Sri Lanka. So I looked at what the actual benefit value that goes to the beneficiaries. So there are about 1.8 million beneficiary families in Samurdhi, and they get, I think, something like 53 billion rupees. And then I also looked at the salary bill for Samurdhi and the number of workers. So what I actually came out with is that on a monthly basis, a Samurdhi staff member gets 55,000 rupees from the program as a salary. But on the other hand, a beneficiary gets only 2,400 rupees, right? So, that's clearly a massive sort of mismatch, because the purpose of the program is for Samurdhi beneficiaries, is to help the poor. So, that's just one program that I looked at. Now, I don't know what, obviously there are lots of there are programs which have a better cost benefit, but in this sense, I'm really not sure.
Yeah, I think the problem is that it's not about how much you spend, it's how you really spend it, isn't it? And you brought this point up when you discussed the Appropriations Bill. The Appropriations Bill, if I understand it right, is the money that's made available to the ministries, correct?
That's right. Ministries and the organizers.
Ministries and the organizers. Okay. And the amount was 2.5 trillion rupees. So I just want to repeat, 2.5 trillion rupees. It's a lot of money just on the ministries. Defense, education, civil pensions. 4th is healthcare. 5 is highways. So how would you change this? I think obviously you've mentioned in your blog that defense is something that we need to look at. Would you like to elaborate on that a little bit?
So if we look at, now, without just looking at sort of the institutions or the ministries that the money is going to, if you take the whole government sort of the budget and look at what are the line items, we see about 72% of government revenue going towards paying government sort of salaries and pensions. And then I think you earlier mentioned, Dr. Dimel had said 72% of government revenue was going to pay interest on loans. So, obviously there's a massive deficit, obviously, right? There's going to be, because our tax sort of revenue is only some, I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but
it's a lot more than perhaps people realize, because there seems to be a lot of money that circulates, but it seems that we collect all this revenue, it goes into the Ministry of Finance, and then it's like a tap that sort of drips out. Everything just gets caught in the system.
It's less of a dripping and more sort of a gushing out.
Gushing out,
yes.
sorry, yeah. So, I mean, where do we fix that from? I mean, I guess the central question is who's willing to sort of give up the political capital to make these difficult changes. And it should be, it's counterintuitive that you would look after the few and not the many, because essentially the poorest people, like you said, have been taking the brunt of this for the longest time. They've been the ones that pay most of the taxes as well. So how do we go about? I mean, to me, I don't know if I'm oversimplifying the situation, but it seems like if you can increase the government revenue, the portion that corporate tax pays into government revenue, if you can take away some of the regressive taxes, and maybe you can even increase some of the luxury taxes, because a lot of people, when we used to go out a few years ago, if you go to a restaurant in Colombo, you're paying 20-25% more on VAT. Now, I don't think that's quite the case right now, but I'm not feeling that much better when I go and eat out, because even though that 25%, which was a long time ago, I feel like there are certain industries where the consumer can perhaps cope with a slightly higher margin, but we know that the poorest in the country absolutely cannot deal with higher prices of milk powder, higher prices of essential items. So it seems like a very basic thing that the government can do, but it just isn't doing it for some reason. Its own popularity is suffering. We've seen the ministers in the governing coalition leaving. What do you think's behind this? I mean, surely even the private sector can come forward and say, we can probably afford to pitch in a little more than we're doing.
Yes. So I think interestingly, because you mentioned sort of the luxury taxes and the corporate taxes, in this year's budget we do see sort of there's an attempt to introduce these super rich taxes and sort of I think, but these are all one-off taxes, and there's also an issue of their sort of retrospective. Right. So it would go to your previous year's incomes and tax that. So there is that sends a wrong signal, because then you're saying that an investor is going to be looking at it and thinking, okay, this is the tax regime is very interesting and very sort of good for me, but then I don't know what will happen next year, because what if they decide to tax my income this year? So it's really about a sort of reforming that whole tax structure, and sticking to something solid for a long period of time to build sort of the confidence within because the private sector will always adjust, right? They're not going to go out of business. I have never heard of an organization which says, oh, it's too much taxes, I'm not going to do business. They'll always adjust. There's always be an adjustment. So
I think this is the central thing that I think you touched on, because there seems to be a lot of we need to incentivize the business sector. But I've always found that a funny phrasing, because surely the incentive for business is profit, right? That profit is why you go into business. So other than that, do you really need to provide even more incentives on top of that at these, and there's an opportunity cost, right? When you provide an incentive to a business, you're taking away something else. Now, I understand Sri Lanka, obviously, from as far as I can remember, let's say from the 90s onwards, they've been talking about becoming a transportation hub, an education hub. I remember in the 90s, there was an idea to develop IT professionals and make Sri Lanka an IT hub, because India was doing the same thing. But I think at the core of it, we sort of missed the boat on a lot of these hubs, because now everywhere you look, there's a hub. How do you think Port City, which is meant to be another hub of some sort, maybe a free trade zone, maybe a financial district of some sort? The question then, I suppose, is why did China decide to have a port city in Sri Lanka? You could have dredged up sand, and they're doing it in the South China Sea. So why did they do it in Sri Lanka? Why in Colombo, whatever is it Colombo 12?
So yeah, I think China and Sri Lanka have sort of had quite good relations, and it's probably maybe a geopolitical decision to include Sri Lanka in their so-called Belt and Road Initiative. And I definitely there have been a lot of white elephant projects, but may be too early to say, but I don't think Port City is going to end up like that, because they are the way, at least the plan that has been shared, and now the Port City Commission which has been set up, and the way that it has been structured to operate seems to be kind of very attractive for outsiders to come in. Now, whether those benefits will sort of spill over to the rest of the economy, I suppose is yet to be seen, because we don't know what the port city will mean for employment of local people.
Sri Lankans,
we still don't know that, so it would really depend. And if we are talking about a financial district, or some even if it's going to be sort of a knowledge hub, then we need to think about how are Sri Lankans geared for such a to deliver such services. Is our education system geared to deliver competitive labor for such initiatives? So if that is the goal, then I think we need to take a step back and evaluate what do we need to do to make sure that, okay, once Port City is up and running, Sri Lankans are ready to go out and offer services competitively. And it should not be something, it should not be another protectionist where you say, okay, you need to give X percentage of jobs to locals, because that's going to be very unattractive. So it has to be more of, Sri Lanka has to be attractive to them and not sort of.
Yeah, my main problem with the port city is that I think it was the Foreign Secretary, Rear Admiral Colombo, I believe, he said something on an international, I think it was Al Jazeera, and he was saying that when they asked him for justification because of the geopolitical issues, how do you justify the port city and etc., and he brought up the need to create this investment environment, and he basically brought up all the weaknesses of the Sri Lankan investment product. Basically, he said, "Oh, there's too many labor restrictions. There's not enough. The costs are too high. There's too much bureaucracy, etc." So it seemed to me conceptually they know all the problems.
It really begs the question: why don't we extend all of this to the rest of the country, right? Why are we boxing it just in?
It seems like why would you not want to fix what's wrong here, but you're instead starting a small area here where everything is right? It seems a little bit counterintuitive for them. Why wouldn't you try to fix these structural problems first and then think about a port city? When because I would assume that we've signed a certain agreement with the Chinese principals on this as well. And I suppose those agreements would have been more to our benefit if there was something more to offer. But here it seems like we've sort of said, okay, just come and do this project. We'll give you everything you need. And I think there's still a lot of consternation about the makeup of the commission and how many foreign principals there may be on the board, on the executive committees. Can we just once again just go back to the IMF? Because I think that at the end of the day, as you said, a lot of people think that, okay, if you go to the IMF, everything's solved. The other side thinks that if you go to the IMF, we're going to be in deeper trouble. I spoke to I spoke to Deshal Dimel recently, and he was saying on this very show, and he was saying that it's not even about how much money you get from the IMF. It's really about the signal that it sends to the market. And what I think he was sort of alluding to is, even if you were to take a smaller package that doesn't require too many conditions, it sends a signal. Now, I think the two political sides are sort of wrangling over this. They're playing to the gallery. They're saying that, okay, we don't want to risk our sovereignty, one side is saying. The other side is completely ignoring the sovereignty argument. They're sort of saying, oh, there's no risk to sovereignty. And whether that's true or not, people will automatically get nervous, because I think it's been ingrained in the Sri Lankan psyche that the entire world is out to exploit us, and all this, the colonial hangover and that sort of thing. Do you see this as a problem in Sri Lanka, where we want to engage with the world, but we have within us this insecurity about our own cultures and our own sort of Sri Lankan way of life? We mentioned even labor laws and labor protections. Will we survive in this global market going forward? How do you see this playing out for Sri Lanka?
So I think it really comes down to sort of a cultural mindset and the sort of the narrative that has been pushed by politicians and political leaders over time. We do sort of, something Sri Lanka seem to lack is sort of the ability to take a step back and look at a problem, without any bias and to sort of assess it for what it is. So I think we tend to sort of fall into a lot of these narratives about, oh, they're out to get us, they're going to exploit us, they're going to take this, they're going to take that, we are selling this, we are selling that, without actually thinking is that even the case, right?
Right.
So now, if we take, for example, the Hambantota port, which was, we gave, we went into an agreement with China and
merchant,
which helped us a lot with our debt situation back in the day. But then also there was this narrative of, we are selling our national assets. But Sri Lanka is a small country, right? We have to make use of what we have to sort of bring international attention and international investors to Sri Lanka. And there's no point in us holding on to these assets if we are not going to make them productive, right? So if somebody else has the technology or the technical know-how to come in and to make that into something, make that profitable or make that more productive, we should be open to them. We should be, we should sort of, tell them, yes, please come in and help us and, teach us how to do that as well.
I guess it's how we negotiate with them as well, right? Because if you're negotiating from a point of weakness, you're obviously going to accept whatever the other party tells you.
That's true, yes.
So in terms of the money printing issue, something that's been talked about a lot. I'm sure you're familiar with modern monetary theory. It's something that's caught on recently because I think a lot of the Keynesian type of economists, they see modern monetary theory as sort of a get out of jail card where the idea is that you can print any amount of money without there being inflation. Now, again, Dr. Howard Nicholas has talked about this. He doesn't see it in quite the same way. He's obviously not an MMTer. He said that openly. He believes that obviously there is a limit to how much money you can print. But he says in the last 15 years in the global economy, central banks all over the world, including in advanced economies, the money base has increased by over 600 to 700% in the last 15 years. He points to Japan. Japanese money base used to be 5% of GDP 30 years ago. Today it is 120% of GDP, and yet Japan is struggling to go over 1% inflation. That Japanese printing binge is the greatest money expansion of the monetary supply, including Zimbabwe in this modern era. How do you fall on the modern monetary theory, the money printing aspect? I mean, it seems like, if you have US dollars, it makes sense to me because there's always going to be excess demand for US dollars. Can you say the same about the Sri Lankan rupee, and how is this going to impact credibility and sustainability going forward?
So I think on MMT, there are the sort of the warnings for a small country like Sri Lanka are quite quite alarming. It's not something that we should have engaged in, and it's not something that we should consider a primary policy. Because, as you mentioned, the US has the sovereign right to print dollars, and entire world accepts dollars. So whatever, even if there's inflation, you can just pass it on to the rest of the world, some part of it at least. But now Sri Lanka's issue is we don't have the right to print dollars. We can print rupees, but our problem is not a rupee problem. It's a dollar problem, right? We have to pay our debt in dollars. When we have a balance of payment deficit, we have to pay dollars. When we have a budget deficit, we do go out and take loans in dollars, and then we have to pay those loans in dollars. So definitely, I don't think MMT is suitable for Sri Lanka primarily because we have been running on sort of budget deficits and a BOP deficit for quite a long time. So there's always this excess demand for dollars, as you said, and just going haywire with printing and calling it MMT and we're going to print away our problems. It's not something that's a solution for Sri Lanka, and we are seeing sort of the effects of it now. Inflation is 12%, which is a really high, figure. And if you take food inflation, it's getting close to almost 20%. So we are seeing, and especially if you consider the COVID period and sort of the post, not post-COVID, but post 2020, even production has been affected to a certain extent. So there's no additional sort of, there's no increase in production for those increased rupees to get absorbed into. So obviously it's going to go into whatever already exists in the market, and that's obviously going to increase prices. So I'm not an MMT proponent.
Just to follow up on that, so I think I've noticed personally a sort of a shift in how economics is viewed in the world. Now, during, let's say, even the Obama era in the early 2008 onwards, there was a lot of, in the United States, fiscal hawkery. There was a lot of worry about the fiscal deficit. That's always been a condition of the right. They've always said there's too much debt, it's not sustainable, fiscal deficits are bad, etc., etc. Now, when the most recent Republican President Donald Trump came in, he went on a spending spree that even outdid the Obama administration. In fact, he went to the extent of, during the pandemic, sending out cash checks to people in the United States. So that's a very big shift in terms of how right-wing economists think, because a lot of people in his staff were right-wing economists. Sri Lanka also came out with our own stimulus package where we doled out cash to people. Now, there's two sides to it, right? You have to expect the government to do something, to provide some immediate relief, however small it may be. At the same time, we really can't afford the 220 odd billion rupees that was there. Could you comment a little bit on the stimulus package?
Sure. So even even Biden's administration, they did same thing. They also sent out stimulus checks to everyone, and because of that, they're also seeing a spending spree because everybody got $1,400 in their bank account overnight, and then there was all this pent up demand, and now you're seeing sort of their ports are stacked high with containers. They don't have enough drivers. And then you're also seeing this issue of the great resignation where people are not coming to work because they have this money in their bank account. And then there's also sort of a cultural reevaluation of, do I really want to go back to this terrible workplace and earn $7 or $8 an hour? So I mean, Sri Lanka is different in that context because our issue is not that we are not on really a spending spree, except maybe probably the middle class and the upper, the upper
middle
income,
class, yes. Definitely, yeah.
There is a pent-up demand, you can see. But I think what's happening in Sri Lanka is sort of it's widening the gap between the people who have money to spend and the ones
You've
who
mentioned
don't
the
have.
Gini coefficients before.
Yes,
you're right.
So I think that's what's happening in Sri Lanka, and with the stimulus package, which was announced recently, some 229 billion rupees. So just to put that into context, that's about $1 billion, right? And put that more into sort of perspective, even the Southern Expressway didn't cost that much. It cost $750 million. And the Hambantota port, I think, cost $1.5 billion. So it sort of also goes back to that question of fiscal indiscipline, which you mentioned. Because in his speech, the finance minister was very specific. He said, we are not going to be increasing salaries. We are not going to, give any more relief. Don't expect anything from us. And then it's not even been, it's just been over a month since that. And then already we are seeing them renegade on those promises. And also he also said we are not going to, there's not going to be supplementary estimates. So basically what that means is once the budget is passed, you put in a request for a supplementary expenditure. And that is outside what has already been passed. And he said strictly no. But then you can see that there is. And once again, what we are seeing is now, according to what's being proposed, they're going to be giving 5,000 rupees every month to Samurdhi beneficiaries, to civil servants, to pensioners, to disabled soldiers. So basically what's happening is now the government doesn't have any fiscal space to do this, right? So what's it going to do? Obviously going to borrow and do this, right? So basically what happens is, as soon as you take the 5,000 rupees, a poor person takes the 5,000 rupees to their hand, their purchasing power falls by more than that, right? So is there really any relief? I mean, is this stimulus package really going to stimulate? That's I suppose the question.
What would you do, Rehana? Just final question. I mean, there's not a lot of space to maneuver. There's not a lot of access to finance. There's no space in the budget. But you have to also understand, I guess, people need some relief, especially the lowest income brackets, the daily wage worker, the farmers, the peasantry. I mean, is there anything that you think the government should do tomorrow or next week that we can at least start showing, giving people a bit of respite while you make these long-term painful decisions?
I mean, I'm really glad that I'm not in the position of, running the country or, having to make these decisions. It really is, what you would call between a rock and a hard place. It's either are we going to default on our debt and then face the repercussions of that, or are we going to continue with these really strict import bans and the forex, the shortage of forex, and then obviously what that leads to is a lot of shortages in essential items. So I think, if it was me, I probably would have gone to the IMF a long time ago and talked about restructuring the debts. But, I'm starting to wonder whether it's getting too late now. So, I mean, the government really needs to think, this year we have to pay $7.3 billion. It's not an easy task. It wouldn't have been an easy task even in the best of times, and we are not in the best of times. So if we are talking about providing relief, then maybe we ought to think about, should we be taxing upper middle income earners and high income earners, corporates? Should we be taxing them and shifting the burden onto them and then giving relief to the masses or the poor people through maybe a cash assistance program? So yeah, those are the decisions.
You're not against cash injections then? I mean, because there's a bit of a debate around that, whether it's worth giving people the money, they'll just spend it anyway. But I feel like that's what our economy runs on, is on consumption. So it makes sense. Rehana, thanks a lot. Not against cash, because a lot of economists seem to think it's like, in principle, it's wrong or something.
I think maybe once Sri Lanka is sort of developed to a certain state or certain sort of a higher, situation or more advanced economy, we can relook at that. But I think given the state we are in, that's certainly not something I'm against.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, Rehana, and I look forward to reading your blog as well in the future. And let's see where this government and the Finance Ministry leads us. So thanks again for being on Insight.
Thank you for having me, Kusum.